On the morning of June 4, 1942, three of the most powerful warships in the Imperial Japanese Navy were burning. Not one, not two. Three carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, were struck within roughly 5 minutes of each other, set ablaze, and ultimately lost. And here is the detail that still makes naval historians pause and reach for another cup of coffee. The aircraft that did it had been circling overhead, lost and nearly out of fuel for the better part of the morning. They found those carriers almost by accident. But here is the question that doesn't have a clean answer, even now, more than 80 years later. If the Japanese strike force was so powerful, the same Kido Butai that had shattered the American fleet at Pearl Harbor just 6 months before, how did a smaller, outmatched, still recovering American Navy manage to find them, hit them, and shatter them in a single morning? And why on that particular day did the most meticulously trained naval air arm in the world fail to get a single fighter in position to stop it? We'll get there. But first, we need to understand how desperate things looked from the American side on the morning it all began. Before we settle in, if you find value in what we do here, a like or a subscribe genuinely keeps these documentaries coming. And if you served in the Pacific, or if your father or grandfather came home with stories from those years, I would be honored if you shared them in the comments below. The people watching this program are exactly the audience those stories deserve. Now, dim the lights, perhaps put a fan on low for that soft background hum, and let's ease into the story together. Chapter 2, 6 Months of Disaster, the Pacific before Midway. To understand what Midway meant, to understand why grown men wept when the news came through, why admirals who hadn't shown emotion in years apparently struggled to compose themselves, you have to understand what the 6 months before it felt like from the American side. And the honest answer is catastrophic. December 7, 1941 had not merely damaged the United States Pacific Fleet. It had done something arguably worse. It had shocked an entire nation into the sudden sickening realization that the ocean, which had always felt like a protective moat, 2,000 miles of deep Pacific between California and anything hostile, was no protection at all. The Japanese Navy had reached across that water and struck with a precision and audacity that nobody in Washington had believed possible. They were wrong, and the price for being wrong was 8 battleships sunk or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed on the ground, and 2,403 Americans dead before breakfast on a Sunday morning. The battleships were the symbol of it. The Arizona, struck by an armor-piercing bomb that detonated her forward ammunition magazine, went down in 9 minutes. 9 minutes. She took 1,177 men with her, and she is still there today, resting in 40 feet of water in Pearl Harbor, still leaking small amounts of oil, what some have called her black tears, more than 80 years later. The Arizona is not a memorial because someone decided to build one there. She is a memorial because she never left. What followed Pearl Harbor was a cascade of disasters that the United States had no framework to absorb. In the weeks and months that came after, the news from the Pacific arrived in a relentless sequence that left American commanders grasping for something, anything, that looked like a foothold. The Japanese had moved with a speed and coordination that still impresses military historians today. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, they had struck Clark Field in the Philippines, destroying the majority of General MacArthur's air forces on the ground. Within days, they had landed in Malaya. Within weeks, the fortress of Singapore, which the British had confidently called impregnable, which Churchill had genuinely believed could hold, fell in one of the most humiliating defeats in the history of the British Empire. 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered to a Japanese force roughly half their size. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. He was not wrong. Then came the Java Sea, then Bataan, then Corregidor, then Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Burma. The Japanese advance moved like something out of a nightmare, methodical, rapid, apparently unstoppable, and the American and Allied forces opposing it seemed perpetually one step behind, always reacting, always improvising, never quite managing to find stable ground. By late spring of 1942, Japan controlled a strategic arc stretching from Burma in the west, through Malaya, the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines, across the vast Pacific to Wake Island and the Gilbert Islands in the east. It was one of the most rapid conquests of territory in modern history, accomplished in less than 6 months, at a cost far below what Japanese planners had feared. And at the center of it all was the Kido Butai, the first air fleet, the most powerful carrier, striking force the world had ever seen. 6 carriers. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, the Shokaku, the Zuikaku. Together they carried nearly 500 aircraft, Mitsubishi Zero fighters, Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, Aichi Val dive bombers crewed by some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. These were men who had trained for years, men who had practiced carrier landings so many times the procedure was as automatic as breathing, men who had already attacked Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Colombo, Trincomalee, and numerous targets across 2 oceans. They had not lost yet, not once, not in 6 months of nearly continuous combat operations. And in the spring of 1942, their commander, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, arguably the most brilliant naval strategist Japan had produced, was planning the operation that would, he believed, finish the job Pearl Harbor had started. That operation was Midway. And here's the second thing. The thing that makes the Battle of Midway not simply a military engagement, but a story about information, about secrets, and about one of the most consequential intelligence operations in American history. By the time Yamamoto's fleet sailed for Midway in late May of 1942, the Americans already knew they were coming. They knew the approximate date. They knew the approximate size of the force. They even knew or suspected the general direction of approach. They knew because a small group of code breakers, working in a basement in Honolulu, had broken the Japanese naval code. This is one of history's more remarkable bureaucratic understatements. A man named Joseph Rochefort had been running a team of analysts, most of them exhausted, most of them working on almost no sleep, at least one of whom had taken to wearing a bathrobe and carpet slippers to work because formal dress had ceased to seem like the point who had been picking apart Japan's JN-25 naval code for months. They hadn't broken all of it. You rarely break all of a code, but they had broken enough to see the outline of what was coming. Chapter 3: The Men in the Basement. Breaking Japan's Naval Code. Joseph Rochefort was, by most accounts, a difficult man to work for, and an even more difficult man to work around. He was obsessive, demanding, convinced of his own judgment in ways that occasionally bordered on the impolite, and he had developed the particular personality type that prolonged sleep deprivation tends to produce in people who were already intense to begin with. He had been living in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor for months, literally living there, sleeping on a cot when he slept at all, wearing a kimono and slippers because he had decided that normal clothing was an inefficiency, and conducting his work with the focused intensity of a man who understood, at a cellular level, that the answer he was looking for had a deadline. The code they were working on was Japan's operational naval cipher, designated JN-25 by American analysts. It was a complex system, a codebook of roughly 45,000 5-digit groups, each representing a word or phrase, enciphered using a separate additive table that changed regularly. Breaking it required not just intelligence, but something closer to intuition, the ability to recognize patterns in partial data, to make probabilistic leaps from incomplete information, to hold several competing interpretations in mind simultaneously and slowly, painstakingly eliminate the wrong ones. Rochefort's team had been at it for months, and by the spring of 1942, they had recovered perhaps 40% of the current codebook. Not complete, not comfortable, but enough. The intercepts had been pointing, with increasing clarity, toward a major Japanese operation somewhere in the Central Pacific. The target was consistently designated in Japanese communications as AF. And here is where the story takes a turn that belongs less in a military history than in a spy novel. Rochefort's team was fairly confident that AF meant Midway Atoll, the small American-held island roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu, which sat at the geographic hinge point of the Central Pacific. But fairly confident, was not the same as certain, and the intelligence establishment in Washington, which had its own analysts and its own opinions, was not entirely convinced. Washington thought AF might be the Aleutian Islands, or perhaps Hawaii itself. So Rochefort did something elegant. He arranged for the Midway garrison to send a plaintext, unencrypted radio message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Shortly after, Japanese signals traffic was intercepted reporting that AF was experiencing a water shortage. The confirmation was immediate and definitive. AF was Midway. Rochefort's instinct had been right, Washington's skepticism had been wrong, and Admiral Chester Nimitz, the quiet, methodical Texan who had taken command of the Pacific Fleet in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, now knew not just where the Japanese were going, but approximately when they were going there. The question was whether he could do anything useful with that information. The answer, as of late May 1942, was barely. Chapter 4. What Nimitz had to work with. The numbers were not encouraging. Japan was bringing to Midway a force of staggering complexity and scale, not just the Kido Butai's 4 carriers, but an invasion fleet of troop ships and support vessels, a bombardment group, a submarine cordon, a diversionary force aimed at the Aleutians, and a main battleship force under Yamamoto himself, trailing the carriers by several hundred miles. In total, something approaching 200 ships. Against this, Nimitz had 3 carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, 2 cruiser divisions, and a screen of destroyers. 3 carriers, except the Yorktown barely counted. She had taken a bomb hit at the Battle of the Coral Sea 3 weeks earlier, a hit significant enough that Japanese intelligence had concluded she was either sunk or out of action for months. Pearl Harbor's naval engineers gave Nimitz an estimate of 90 days to repair her properly. Nimitz told them they had 72 hours. What followed in that dry dock was one of those moments that, if it appeared in a novel, a reasonable editor would flag as implausible. 1,400 men worked around the clock in 3 shifts. They welded temporary patches over damaged sections. They bypassed destroyed systems. They left tools inside the hull when there wasn't time to retrieve them. They didn't restore the Yorktown to perfect condition. They made her functional enough to fight in 72 hours. Because 72 hours was what they had. Those who worked in shipyards and defense plants during the war years will recognize something in that story. The particular American talent, if it can be called that, for improvisation under pressure. For deciding that the textbook answer about how long something takes is a starting point for negotiation rather than a fact. The Yorktown left Pearl Harbor on the morning of May 28th, steaming to join the Enterprise and Hornet at a rendezvous point northeast of Midway. She was leaking oil. Some of her repairs were, to put it diplomatically, optimistic, but she was moving. She was carrying aircraft, and she was about to confuse Japanese naval intelligence considerably. We'll get to the specific moment when the Yorktown's unexpected presence changed the entire tactical calculation. But that story requires understanding exactly what Yamamoto was trying to do and why his plan, for all its complexity, contained a flaw that would ultimately prove fatal. Chapter 5. Yamamoto's Gamble, a plan of beautiful complexity. 212 years before the Battle of Midway, a Prussian military theorist named Karl von Clausewitz had not yet been born. But if he had been alive in the spring of 1942 and had read Yamamoto's operational plan for Midway, he might have recognized in it something he would later write about extensively, the dangerous tendency of military planners to assume that the enemy will cooperate. Yamamoto's plan was, by any objective standard, a masterpiece of complexity. And complexity in war is a liability as much as an asset. The operation involved at least 5 separate fleet components operating in rough coordination across thousands of miles of ocean. The Kido Butai, now operating with 4 carriers rather than 6, since the Shokaku had been damaged at Coral Sea and the Zuikaku had lost too many experienced aircrew to be combat-ready, would approach Midway from the northwest and launch strikes to suppress the atoll's defenses. Simultaneously, a diversionary attack would hit the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention northward. An invasion force would stand ready to land troops on Midway once the carriers had cleared the way. And Yamamoto himself, with a force of battleships, would wait in reserve several hundred miles behind, ready to sweep in and destroy the American carriers when they sortied from Pearl Harbor to respond. The underlying logic was sound. If the Americans knew Midway was threatened, they would have to respond. They couldn't afford not to. Midway's loss would push the Japanese defensive perimeter uncomfortably close to Hawaii and give Japan an airbase for reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor itself. Yamamoto assumed the Americans would sortie to defend it, and he planned to be waiting. What the plan required, however, was that the Americans not know it was coming until it was already underway, that they would be surprised as they had been at Pearl Harbor, that they would respond in a disorganized rush rather than a calculated ambush. The plan was built, in other words, on the assumption that the Americans were in the dark, and as Rochefort's team in their basement had already established, they were not. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes from knowing in advance what your enemy is planning, and a particular kind of pressure, too, because knowing and being able to stop it are not the same thing. Nimitz knew the approximate date. He knew the approximate axis of approach. He knew the approximate composition of the Japanese force. What he did not know, what no one could know in advance, was whether the information was complete, whether the Japanese had changed their plans, and whether 3 American carriers could inflict enough damage on 4 Japanese carriers to actually matter. He decided to try. Chapter 6. Setting the Trap. Point Luck. The position that Nimitz chose for his carriers has one of the better names in naval history. It was designated Point Luck, which, given what subsequently happened there, turns out to have been appropriately named. It sat approximately 325 miles northeast of Midway, far enough from the atoll to avoid being swept up in the initial Japanese air attacks, close enough to move into striking range once the enemy carriers were located. Task Force 16, Enterprise and Hornet arrived first, under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance is one of the more interesting personalities in the story. He had been, until shortly before the battle, not a carrier admiral at all, but a cruiser commander. He was standing in for Admiral William Halsey, who had been hospitalized with a severe skin condition so debilitating that he reportedly couldn't wear clothes without considerable discomfort. Halsey had personally recommended Spruance as his replacement, which, given that the 2 men had rather different temperaments, said something about Halsey's judgment. Spruance was quiet, methodical, not given to dramatic gestures. He had no particular experience with carrier aviation. He turned out to be exactly the right man, but we'll return to that. Task Force 17, the Yorktown, arrived on the 1st of June under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the senior officer present and therefore in overall command of the operation. Fletcher had been at Coral Sea. He knew his ship was not in ideal condition. He also knew, because Nimitz had told him, that the engagement they were sailing toward might determine whether the United States retained any meaningful ability to contest the Pacific for the foreseeable future. The 2 task forces rendezvoused at Point Luck on June 2nd. They had perhaps 48 to 72 hours before the Japanese arrived. Those who remember waiting, the particular quality of waiting before something unavoidable, whether on a troop ship or in a staging area or simply in a household that had sent its men overseas, may recognize something in the atmosphere aboard those ships over the next 48 hours. The men who knew, knew. The men who didn't know guessed. And the Pacific, indifferent as always, offered nothing by way of reassurance. There's a reason we'll talk about later, about what the pilots aboard those carriers were told and what they were not told in those final briefings before the battle. The information that was shared and the information that was withheld shaped the decisions individual aviators made at the most critical moments of the fight. But that story doesn't make sense yet, not without understanding what happened on Midway itself in the early hours of June 4th. Chapter 7. The morning of June 4th. Midway under attack. 4:34 in the morning. June 4th, 1942. A radar operator on Midway, one of the Catalina flying boat crews that had been running long-range search patrols since before dawn, reported contacts. Large contacts. Multiple aircraft, bearing 320 degrees, distance approximately 150 miles, and moving fast. The Midway garrison had known something was coming. They had been on elevated alert for days. The base commander briefed on the intelligence picture, extra aircraft assigned, and additional Marine Corps fighter squadrons brought in to reinforce the island's defenses. They were as ready as they were going to be. That turned out not to be quite ready enough, but it was considerably better than nothing. which was what Pearl Harbor had had 6 months earlier. Midway launched every aircraft it had. The fighters went up to intercept. The bombers, Army B-17s, Navy and Marine dive bombers, torpedo planes were sent off toward the Japanese carriers rather than have them caught on the ground. The reasoning was sound. Better to have aircraft in the air doing something than on the ground doing nothing while the base was being struck. What came at Midway that morning was 108 Japanese aircraft in 2 waves. Zeros, Kates, Vals, launched from the Kido Butai's 4 carriers shortly before dawn. The Japanese strike commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, led his force across the 150 miles of open ocean toward the atoll in tight formation, navigating with practiced precision, arriving over the target with the sun behind him. The Midway defenders, flying Wildcats, and, for the Marine squadrons, a number of older Brewster Buffaloes that the pilots had privately nicknamed Flying Coffins, rose to meet them. The air battle over the atoll that morning was, by any measure, a slaughter. The Zero was, in 1942, a better fighter than anything Midway had, faster, more maneuverable, longer ranged, and flown by pilots with years of combat experience. The Marines knew this and attacked anyway. They had no other option. 17 of Midway's 26 fighter aircraft were shot down or so severely damaged they couldn't fight again. The Japanese lost only a handful of aircraft in the entire engagement. But Midway's fighters had done something. They had disrupted the attacking formation, scattered the bombers enough to reduce accuracy, and bought time, and they had bought it by flying directly into a vastly superior force without hesitation. That is worth acknowledging. Some of the pilots who went up that morning were barely past their teenage years. The bombing of Midway did considerable damage. The fuel storage area was hit. The post-exchange, a somewhat gentler phrase for the facility than the circumstances warranted, was destroyed. Several aircraft hangars were demolished, but the airstrip itself remained functional, and Lieutenant Tomonaga, circling overhead and assessing the damage, sent back a message to the carriers that would, in retrospect, be the first link in a chain of decisions that cost Japan 4 aircraft carriers before the day was out. He reported that a second strike on Midway was necessary before an invasion could proceed. That message set in motion a decision that still provokes argument among naval historians, more than 8 decades later. But it also set the clock running on something else entirely, because while Tomonaga's aircraft were over Midway, and while Admiral Chuchi Nagumo aboard the Akagi was considering his response, something else was happening that nobody aboard the Japanese carriers knew about yet. Approximately 215 miles to the northeast, 3 American carriers were turning into the wind. Chapter 8, Nagumo's Dilemma, the Rearming Decision. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was sitting with a problem that had no comfortable solution. His strike aircraft were returning from Midway. Tomonaga's message had said a second strike was needed. The next wave of aircraft, the reserve force held back in case American surface ships appeared, was currently armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, the weapons you use against warships. If he was going to send them against Midway's land installations instead, he needed to swap that ordnance out, replace the torpedoes with land attack bombs. It was a straightforward enough request, logistically speaking, and his ordnance crews could accomplish it. It would take approximately 90 minutes. Nagumo gave the order. The rearming began. And then, at the worst possible moment, one of his search aircraft sent a message. The report came from a float plane launched earlier that morning from the cruiser Tone, launched late, as it happened, because of a catapult malfunction, which is the kind of detail that makes naval historians grind their teeth, because even small mechanical failures can pivot the course of major battles. The message said, 10 ships, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles, heading 150 degrees. 10 ships, moving toward the Kido Butai. Nagumo asked the obvious question, were any of those ships carriers? Because carriers changed everything. Land attack bombs were useless against carriers. Armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes were not. The float plane, already at the edge of its transmission range, took time to respond. When the answer came back, one ship appears to be a carrier. Nagumo issued the order to stop rearming and switch back to anti-ship weapons. The ordnance crews, who had already removed most of the torpedoes and were partway through loading the land attack bombs, now had to reverse the entire process. Torpedoes went back on. Land attack bombs came off. And here is the detail that matters most, the one that separates Midway from being merely a significant battle and makes it instead one of those hinge points that the entire subsequent history turned upon. The bombs that were removed were not, as procedure required, struck below to the armored magazine. They were left on deck, piled in the passageways of the hangar deck, stacked near the aircraft, because there wasn't time to properly stow them. And because no one, in that frantic 90 minutes, seriously contemplated the possibility that American aircraft might arrive before the rearming was complete. They were wrong about that. But before we get to what happened at 10:22 in the morning, the 4 minutes that gave this battle its historical weight, we need to follow the American aircraft that were, at this same moment, searching for the carriers, because the story of how those dive bombers found the Kido Butai is not a story of brilliant planning. It is in significant part a story of accident, improvisation, and the particular luck that tends to reward people who have already spent everything they had. And to understand that, we have to start with the torpedo bombers. The ones who went first. The ones who didn't come back. Chapter 9, Torpedo Squadron 8, The Men Who Flew First. Most people know his name. Richard Best, Wade McCluskey, Maxwell Leslie, the dive bomber pilots who found the Japanese carriers and sent them to the bottom. They have entries in the history books, statues in their names, and the kind of biographical footnotes that tell you where they grew up and how many grandchildren they had. John C. Waldron does not get quite the same attention. He should. Waldron was the commander of Torpedo Squadron 8, based aboard the Hornet. He was a Navy man from South Dakota with Sioux ancestry, by his own account, and he was not a man who disguised his opinions about tactical situations. Before the squadron launched on the morning of June 4th, he wrote a note, the kind of note that men write when they have thought carefully about the realistic possibilities before them, which he left with his effects aboard the Hornet. It read in part, "I actually believe that under these conditions we are the best in the world. My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation, but if we don't, and the worst comes to the worst, I want each of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." He knew, on some level, based on what he knew about the performance envelope of the Devastator, the standard Japanese combat air patrol, and the near impossibility of flying a low-altitude torpedo run against an alerted fleet without fighter escort. Waldron knew what the morning likely held. So did his men. They flew anyway. Torpedo Squadron 8 found the Japanese carriers first. They found them because Waldron, disagreeing with the course plotted by the Hornet's air group commander, had simply turned and headed in the direction his instinct told him was right, leaving the rest of the air group behind, flying alone, without fighter protection. It was either brilliant tactical intuition or a reckless deviation from the plan, and the distinction hardly matters because the outcome was the same either way. The Japanese combat air patrol, the Zeros maintaining fighter cover above the fleet, were down at low altitude, chasing the American aircraft that Midway itself had launched against the carriers earlier in the morning. They saw Torpedo 8 coming and attacked. In the next several minutes, all 15 Devastators of Torpedo Squadron 8 were shot down. Not damaged. Not forced to turn back. Shot down. Every single one. 29 men flew with Torpedo 8 that morning. 28 of them did not return. The one survivor, Ensign George Gay, who kept himself afloat for hours by hiding under his life raft's seat cushion to avoid being machine-gunned by Japanese pilots, watched the rest of the battle from the water. He watched the carriers burn. He was picked up the following day by a Catalina. Not a single torpedo launched by Torpedo 8 found its target. Not one. And yet historians and naval analysts have argued for decades that Torpedo 8's attack and the attacks of the two other torpedo squadrons that followed from the Enterprise and Yorktown, both of which were nearly as catastrophically handled, accomplished something vital and completely unintended. They pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to wave-top height. Every Zero in the combat air patrol was chasing torpedo bombers at low altitude when the dive bombers arrived from high above, and the Japanese radar, the few sets they had, and they were not nearly as sophisticated as American radar, had been focused on the wave-level threat. Nobody was looking up. Nobody was looking up. Chapter 10. The dive bombers find their targets. Remember, at the very beginning of tonight's program, we asked how an American strike force that was lost, nearly out of fuel, and scattered across the sky managed to find 4 Japanese carriers and sink 3 of them in roughly 5 minutes. Here is where it all comes together. Commander Wade McCluskey had a problem. He had led the Enterprise Air Group to the position where the Japanese carriers were supposed to be and found nothing but empty ocean. He had been searching for the better part of an hour. His fuel was dropping toward critical levels, and the fundamental question facing him was whether to turn back toward the Enterprise, ensuring the survival of his aircraft and pilots, or continue searching, risking losing the entire group to fuel exhaustion if he didn't find something soon. He kept searching. What he found was a destroyer's wake. A single Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, which had stopped to depth charge an American submarine it had detected, was racing at full speed to rejoin the main fleet, throwing a long white wake across the dark ocean surface that was visible from altitude. McCluskey turned and followed it. He followed a destroyer's wake to the Kido Butai. That is the accident. That is the fragment of unplanned contingency at the center of the most decisive moment in the Pacific War. A submarine had forced a destroyer to stop. The destroyer's haste to rejoin the fleet left a visible trail. A dive bomber commander, running low on fuel after a fruitless search, happened to look in the right direction at the right moment. And at the end of that white line, below and slightly to the right, were 4 Japanese fleet carriers. McCluskey radioed back to the Enterprise, then split his group. His 2 dive bomber squadrons, Bombing 6 and Scouting 6, would attack simultaneously, each taking a different carrier. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading the Yorktown's Bombing 3, arrived over the Japanese fleet within minutes from a different approach vector. By coincidence, by the same convergence that occasionally hands history its more dramatic moments, and took the 3rd carrier. At 10:22 in the morning, they began their dives. The Dauntless was not the most glamorous aircraft in the American inventory. It was slow for a combat aircraft, underpowered by fighter standards, and its rear-facing gunner position, essentially a man sitting backwards in the open air with a machine gun, was not what anyone would describe as a comfortable combat assignment. But it was stable. And stability in a dive-bombing attack was the quality that mattered above every other. A stable aircraft, in the hands of a trained pilot, could put a bomb through a very precise point from a very considerable height. The bombs hit the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu within approximately 5 minutes of each other. And because of the decision to leave the rearming ordnance stacked on the hangar decks rather than stowing it properly, each hit did not merely damage the ships. It set off the ammunition, the fuel lines, the armed aircraft waiting below decks with full tanks and loaded weapons. Each ship became, in the space of a few minutes, a catastrophic secondary explosion that no damage control team in the world could have managed. The Kaga was hit by 4 bombs and burned so ferociously that her crew could not save her. She sank that afternoon. The Soryu was hit by 3 bombs in quick succession and sank within 20 minutes, faster than any carrier in the battle, faster than almost anyone thought possible for a vessel of her size. The Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was hit by only 1 or 2 bombs, but the secondary explosions from the improperly stowed ordnance turned a survivable hit into an unsurvivable inferno. She burned through the afternoon and had to be scuttled by her own destroyers after midnight. Pause 30's 3 carriers in 5 minutes. Those of you who served in naval operations, or who knew men who did, will understand what this meant at a visceral level that a history book cannot quite convey. A fleet carrier was not just a ship, it was years of construction, months of training, hundreds of expert crew, flight mechanics, aviation ordnancemen, damage control specialists, the experienced pilots who had flown the Pacific campaign since December. Every man aboard those 3 carriers who didn't make it off represented not just a loss in itself, but an irreplaceable subtraction from Japan's capacity to continue fighting the kind of war they had been fighting. Japan could not build carriers and train crews as fast as they were now losing them. America could. The balance of the Pacific War shifted in those 5 minutes. It didn't end. It would grind on for another 3 years, at enormous cost to both sides, but it shifted decisively and permanently, and the people who understood naval strategy knew it immediately. But the day was not over, because there was a fourth carrier. The Hiryu had been sailing at the leading edge of the Japanese formation, slightly separated from the other three, and had escaped the dive-bombing attack. Her commander, Rear Admiral Timon Yamaguchi, did not wait for orders. He launched immediately. Chapter 11. The Hiryu Fights Back. The Yorktown's Ordeal. Yamaguchi was, by reputation, the most aggressive of the Kido Butai's carrier commanders. Some historians believe he was the most gifted naval aviator in the Japanese Navy. Yamamoto had reportedly thought of him as a potential successor. On the afternoon of June 4th, he proved his reputation. Within minutes of watching 3 of Japan's finest carriers erupt in flame, he had aircraft in the air heading for the American fleet. The Hiryu's first strike, 18 Val dive bombers, followed a returning American aircraft back to the Yorktown. That detail is worth holding onto for a moment. The Japanese strike leader didn't navigate to the American fleet by plotting coordinates or following intelligence reports. He followed an American plane home. It was simple, practical, and it worked. The Yorktown's combat air patrol and anti-aircraft guns were formidable, and her crew fought her defense with everything they had. She took 3 bomb hits. Her engine rooms were disrupted. She slowed, began listing, and appeared to the watching Japanese reconnaissance aircraft to be finished, perhaps already sinking. Yamaguchi's airmen returned and reported her sinking. She was not sinking. Her damage control crews, the same exhausted, understaffed, still improvising team who had worked her repair at Pearl Harbor, had her fires out and her boilers partially restored within the hour. She was moving again, slower than before but moving, when the second Japanese strike arrived. 10 Kate torpedo bombers that Yamaguchi had launched on the strength of his pilot's over-optimistic damage report. 2 torpedoes hit. The Yorktown took on a severe list, eventually 36 degrees to port. A list at which almost no normal ship function was possible. A list at which standing upright required holding on to something. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship. The crew went over the side. And here the Yorktown's story becomes one of those endings that weren't, because she didn't sink. Not that afternoon, not that night. She was still afloat the following morning, listing badly but floating when a salvage party went back aboard. A destroyer was brought alongside to help with stability. The salvage crew worked through the night, making slow progress. We'll return to the Yorktown's final chapter shortly, because her ending is both sadder and more complex than it first appears. But before that, we have to follow what happened to the Hiryu, because Spruance had not been idle while his Yorktown was being attacked. 24 dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown. The Yorktown's aircraft had been transferred to Enterprise and Hornet. When it became clear the Yorktown was out of action, found the Hiryu in the early afternoon. They caught her in the same posture that had destroyed her sister ships that morning. Flight deck crowded with aircraft, ordnance in preparation, the frenetic activity of a ship in the middle of rearming for another strike. 4 bombs hit the Hiryu. She burned through the afternoon and into the night. Yamaguchi and her captain, Tomeo Kaku, chose not to leave their ship. By early morning of June 5th, she too was gone. Pause 3 vos os carriers, in less than a day. Pause 2 vos os coes. Those who have studied military history, and this audience has studied a great deal of it, many of you lived through the years these events shaped, will recognize how extraordinary this was. The Kido Butai that struck Pearl Harbor in December had been the most powerful naval air force in the world. By the morning of June 5th, 1942, it had ceased to exist as an offensive force. Chapter 12. The Night of June 4th. Yamamoto Considers. 260 miles to the northwest, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the news in silence. He had 9 battleships. He had cruisers. He still had the light carrier Zuiho, the smaller carriers of the Aleutian Diversionary Force, and for the moment, the Hiryu, though her fate was already sealed. and somewhere in the darkness ahead, 2 American carriers were waiting. The question Yamamoto faced that evening was not simple. Despite how it might appear from the comfort of hindsight, he had overwhelming superiority in surface ships. His battleships outgunned anything the Americans had. In a night surface action, the kind of engagement that Japanese naval doctrine had spent years preparing for, the kind of close-quarters nocturnal battle the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained its crews to fight with extraordinary precision, he could, conceivably, still destroy the American fleet. The guns were still loaded. The destroyers were still fueled. The night was still young. Several of Yamamoto's staff officers urged exactly this. Advance, find the Americans in the darkness, use the battleships. It was the kind of aggressive action that Japanese naval culture admired and rewarded, and there were officers aboard the Yamato who believed, genuinely, that the battle was not yet decided. But Yamamoto hesitated. And in that hesitation, that particular fateful pause, lies one of the more debated questions of the entire Pacific War. Was he simply being cautious? Was he, as some have suggested, already calculating that the loss of the 4 carriers made continued offensive operations strategically untenable regardless of what happened tonight? Or was there something else, some private reckoning that he had already made before the fleet sailed, some acceptance of an outcome he had privately anticipated? Yamamoto is, in some ways, the most interesting figure in the entire Battle of Midway, more complex, perhaps, than Nagumo or Spruance or Fletcher, because he understood things about the war he was fighting that he could not say aloud. He was a man who had lived in America, who had driven across its landscape, who had visited its factories and absorbed with a naval strategist's careful attention the scale of American industrial production. He had told the Japanese government before Pearl Harbor that he could guarantee success for perhaps 6 months to a year, after which he could not answer for the outcome. He had been right about the 6 months. Pearl Harbor had been December. Midway was June. He turned the fleet around. The order went out in the early hours of June 5th. The combined fleet would withdraw to the northwest. The Midway operation was canceled. For the first time since December 7, 1941, the Kido Butai, or what remained of it, was in retreat. Spruance, to his credit, and the relief of his subordinates, did not pursue. He was a cautious man by temperament, not timid. There is a significant difference, and he had done the arithmetic. The carriers he was protecting were the only ones America had in the Pacific. He had won a decisive victory. Pressing northwest in the darkness, chasing battleships that outgunned him with a force that was running low on fuel and ordnance, was not what he described as sound military reasoning. He held his position, recovered his aircraft, and spent the night where he was. Some criticize this decision. Most historians who have examined it closely consider it one of the best command decisions of the battle. Chapter 13. The Yorktown's Final Hours. There is a particular quality of cruelty in the way the Yorktown died. Not the quick, violent end of the Kaga or the Soryu, ships consumed so rapidly they were barely recognizable as ships before they were gone. The Yorktown lingered. She was still afloat on the morning of June 5th, still listing, still surrounded by a destroyer screen, still with a salvage party working aboard her, still technically alive. Her crew had fought for her with everything available, had abandoned her only when it seemed no other option existed, and had then, because this was the Navy, and because that ship was theirs, gone back. The destroyer Hammond came alongside and made fast. Pumping operations began. Progress was slow but measurable. The list was being slowly, painfully corrected, degree by degree. The men working her believed she could be saved. There was genuine reason to believe they were right. On the afternoon of June 6th, a Japanese submarine, the I-168, which had earlier shelled Midway and had been ordered by Yamamoto to find and finish the damaged American carrier, slipped through the destroyer screen. The submarine's commander, Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, navigated with extraordinary skill, avoiding the destroyers, diving under the anti-submarine patrol, and firing a spread of 4 torpedoes at close range. 2 torpedoes hit the Yorktown. One hit the Hammond, breaking her in half. The Hammond sank in approximately 4 minutes, taking 80 men with her. The depth charges in her racks, set to safe but still dangerous under the pressure of a rapid sinking, detonated underwater among the men who had jumped overboard, killing or injuring dozens of swimmers. The Yorktown struck again, began settling deeper. The salvage party was taken off. The escorts recovered survivors from the water. There was nothing else to do. Through the afternoon and into the evening, she settled lower and lower, her list slowly increasing, her hull going deeper, the sea rising around her flight deck, that same flight deck where, just 2 days earlier, aircraft had been launching and recovering in the opening moves of the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar. At 0500 on June 7th, the Yorktown rolled over and sank. She went down in approximately 3,000 meters of water, and she rested there, undisturbed, for 56 years. Robert Ballard, the same oceanographer who found the Titanic, located her in 1998. The wreck photographs show her sitting largely intact on the Pacific floor, her flight deck recognizable, her hull encrusted with deep sea growth, the damage from her wounds still visible on her sides. Veterans of the Pacific, and those who knew men who served on her, if you're watching tonight, her memory is honored here. The Yorktown's crew fought her with exceptional courage, and the men who went back aboard to save her, knowing full well the risks, demonstrated the kind of quiet professionalism that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Those of you who served in the Navy, or whose fathers and grandfathers did, I'd be honored if you shared their stories in the comments below. The human experience of these battles is not in the official histories, it lives in the memories of the people watching tonight, and those memories matter. Chapter 14. The Human Accounting. Midway is often discussed in terms of carriers sunk, aircraft destroyed. The strategic balance shifted. Those numbers are real and significant, but the numbers that don't appear as prominently in the summaries are the ones that deserved more careful attention, then and now. The United States lost 145 aircraft at the Battle of Midway. 307 Americans were killed. Those numbers include the men of Torpedo 3, Torpedo 6, and Torpedo 8 who flew against the Japanese carriers that morning with aircraft that were fundamentally outclassed for the mission they were asked to perform against a combat air patrol and anti-aircraft defense that had been fully alerted to their coming and pressed their attacks anyway. Of the 41 torpedo bomber aircraft that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, only 6 returned. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 292 aircraft, and approximately 3,500 men, including, critically, a large proportion of their most experienced carrier aviation personnel. Pilots, navigators, radiomen, gunners who had trained for years and could not be replaced quickly. The aircraft could be built, the ships could eventually be replaced. The men, the trained, experienced, combat-hardened aircrew who had constituted the Kido Butai's actual striking power, could not simply be manufactured to replace them. Japan's pilot training program was not designed for attrition at this scale. This asymmetry in industrial capacity, in training infrastructure, in the raw ability to absorb losses and regenerate fighting power, was precisely what Yamamoto had tried to forestall by seeking a decisive engagement early. If Japan could destroy the American carrier force before American industry fully mobilized, the war might end on terms favorable to Tokyo before the numbers became overwhelming. Midway closed that window permanently. America, by contrast, had the infrastructure to absorb those losses and keep producing. The Pensacola Naval Air Station was training hundreds of pilots per month. The Corpus Christi facility was expanding. The factories in Connecticut and Maryland and California that made aircraft engines were running 3 shifts. For every carrier pilot America lost at Midway, the training pipeline was producing replacements. Not immediately, not in time for the battles of the coming months, but eventually in numbers that would become overwhelming. Yamamoto had known this. He had gone to Midway hoping to prevent it. Instead, he had lost the fleet that might have made a difference, and the conveyor belt of American industrial production continued running, indifferent to his calculations. Those who worked in defense plants, the women and men who kept those assembly lines running, often through the night, often on 6- and 7-day weeks, were as much a part of what Midway represented as any admiral or aviator. The battle was won over the Pacific, but it was enabled by the factories back home. That connection is worth naming explicitly. Chapter 15. Why it mattered. The strategic consequences of Midway. Surprising number. The Japanese Navy would commission 25 aircraft carriers of various types during the entire course of the Pacific War. America would commission more than 150. That disparity was not the result of Midway. The production programs were already underway before the battle. But Midway was the moment when the disparity ceased to be a future projection and became a present reality, because after June of 1942, Japan was fighting from behind in a race they could not win. The Japanese Navy fought on after Midway with considerable skill and occasional brilliance. Guadalcanal, which began 2 months later, was one of the most brutal and attritional campaigns of the Pacific War, and at several points the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The Japanese Navy won significant surface engagements, Savo Island, Tassafaronga, that demonstrated their continuing tactical excellence in exactly the kind of night surface action Yamamoto had contemplated on the evening of June 4th. They were formidable opponents until the last months of the war. But they were fighting on a narrowing foundation. Each carrier lost, each experienced pilot killed, each trained technician who didn't come home represented a subtraction that could not be matched by Japan's training infrastructure or industrial capacity. America's could. And eventually, inexorably, at enormous human cost to both sides, that arithmetic resolved itself in the only direction it could. Historians debate, and will continue to debate, whether Midway was decisive in the strict sense, whether Japan could have won the war in the Pacific even without losing 4 carriers, given the underlying industrial and demographic realities. The honest answer is probably not. The American industrial mobilization that was already underway made some version of this strategic outcome likely regardless of what happened at Midway. But likely is not inevitable, and the gap between them matters. A Japanese victory at Midway, or even a less catastrophic defeat, might have prolonged the Pacific War by years. It might have extended Japanese control over territories that the populations living under occupation would have found those additional years very costly. It might have changed the political calculations in Washington about how to allocate resources between the Pacific and European theaters. History doesn't run experiments. We can't know. What we can say is that Midway shortened something, and in a war of the scale and brutality of the Pacific conflict, that shortening measured in lives is not a trivial thing. And then there is the smaller, more personal accounting, the one that resists reduction to strategy and industrial capacity and the arc of national histories. The men who didn't come back from Torpedo 8, the Japanese ordnance crews who died below decks on the Kaga when the secondary explosions tore through the hangar, the Yorktown sailors who went over the side when she was abandoned, and the ones who went back aboard, and the ones who were in the water when the Hammond's depth charges went off. Every one of them was somebody's son, somebody's husband, somebody's father. Every one of them had a life they were living before the morning of June 4th interrupted it permanently. That is the part of military history that the strategic surveys and the tactical analyses and the order of battle appendices can't quite contain. And it is, perhaps, the part most worth sitting with. Chapter 16. The Men Who Made It. Portraits after the battle. A battle ends. The ships return to port or don't. The living come home or some of them do. The dead are listed in the official records in alphabetical order, which is the Navy's way of according each name equal weight, and it is probably the right approach, though it strips away every individual story in the process. What happened to the people who made Midway is worth following, because their subsequent fates illuminate something about how America chose to understand what had happened, and what it failed to understand, or chose to misunderstand, in at least one important case. Joseph Rochefort had, by any reasonable measure, just delivered the most significant intelligence achievement in American naval history. He had identified the target, confirmed it with the water plant ruse, provided Nimitz with the date and axis of approach, and given American forces the margin of preparation that made the ambush possible. Without Rochefort's work, without the basement at Pearl Harbor, without the particular combination of obsession and intuition that his team brought to the JN-25 cipher, Midway would have been an ambush in the other direction. Washington thanked him by relieving him of his command. the intelligence establishment in Washington, specifically a rival intelligence organization led by Commander John Redman, whose brother Joseph Redman ran the Navy's communications division, had been in a bureaucratic competition with Rochefort's Station Hypo for months. They had disagreed with Rochefort's identification of AF. They had been wrong. But being wrong in Washington, as many veterans of that city can attest, does not necessarily impede a subsequent bureaucratic victory. The Redman brothers used their proximity to senior Navy leadership to characterize Rochefort's methods as irregular and his reporting as insubordinate. Rochefort was reassigned to a dry dock command in San Francisco, a posting of precisely zero strategic significance, and spent the remainder of the war at a remove from the intelligence work he had been born to do. He never received official recognition during the war. The Navy did not award him the Distinguished Service Medal that Nimitz had recommended. The recommendation was quietly shelved in Washington. It was not until 1985, more than 4 decades later, that Rochefort received posthumous recognition, a Distinguished Service Medal awarded by the Secretary of the Navy at the urging of veterans who had spent years making the case that the record needed correcting. Rochefort had died the previous year. He was 77. This is one of those details that sits in the stomach uncomfortably. The man whose work arguably did more to make Midway possible than any single tactical decision, more than any bomb dropped or torpedo launched, spent the war in a dry dock in San Francisco because he had embarrassed the wrong people in Washington. The history of warfare is full of such stories. They do not diminish the achievement, but they do complicate the clean narrative of competence rewarded and valor recognized. Raymond Spruance went on to have one of the distinguished careers of the Pacific War. He commanded at the Philippine Sea in June 1944, a battle that destroyed the remainder of Japan's carrier aviation in what American pilots nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and later at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. He became Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet after Nimitz, then President of the Naval War College. He was, by the consistent assessment of the officers who served with and under him, one of the finest naval commanders America produced in the 20th century. He was also, characteristically, almost entirely uninterested in discussing his own role at Midway. When people asked about the battle, he consistently redirected credit to the pilots, the intelligence analysts, and the enlisted men. His own decision-making, he seemed to suggest, had merely been the obvious application of available information. Those who had worked with him knew this was, to put it gently, an understatement. George Gay survived his day in the Pacific water, was rescued the following morning, and later wrote a memoir about his experience. He went on to fly combat again, served through the rest of the war, and spent his later years as a commercial airline pilot, the profession that people who love flying tend to return to when the shooting stops. He spoke about Torpedo 8 publicly, on many occasions, with a matter-of-factness that was probably the only emotional register that allowed him to discuss it at all. He outlived most of the people who might have argued about the details with him. He died in 1994. Chapter 17. What the pilots knew and what they were told. There is a dimension to the Battle of Midway that the standard histories touch on briefly, and then tend to move past, perhaps because it is uncomfortable, perhaps because it complicates the cleaner version of the story. It concerns what the torpedo bomber crews were told before they launched, specifically whether they were told about the intelligence picture that had made the entire operation possible. The torpedo bomber crews, the men of Torpedo 3, 6, and 8, were told they would be attacking Japanese carriers. They were told the approximate location and composition of the enemy force. They were not, in most accounts, given a full picture of how confident American intelligence was in that information, nor were they told the scale of the advantage that advance knowledge had provided. Some received more thorough briefings than others, depending on the ship and the commander. What they were not told, in most cases, was that fighter escort was unavailable or inadequate, and that the tactical situation, unescorted torpedo bombers attacking an alerted fleet, combat air patrol, was, in the honest assessment of anyone who understood the performance envelopes involved, approximately suicidal. The reasoning for not telling them this was, presumably, that men who understood clearly they were flying into a near-certain death might make different decisions, perhaps. Or perhaps the men who flew anyway, knowing or suspecting what they faced, were demonstrating something that does not require the comfortable omission of information to be remarkable. The Devastator was already an obsolete aircraft by June of 1942. Grumman was building its replacement, the Avenger, a far more capable machine, and a small number of Avengers had actually been delivered to Midway in time for the battle. 6 of them attacked the Japanese fleet that morning from the island itself. 5 were shot down, the 6th came back with its hydraulic system shot out, its rear gunner dead, its pilot wounded, and 1 unexploded cannon shell lodged in its fuselage. Progress, of a sort. The men in the Devastators knew what they were flying. They had read the performance reports. They were not naive about what the Zero could do to them in a prolonged engagement, especially at low altitude, especially without fighter escort. Some of them had been in the Navy long enough to remember when the Devastator had been modern. That was not very long ago. It had entered service in 1937, but 5 years in aviation, particularly in the 1930s and 40s, when the technology was evolving at a pace that made each year's aircraft meaningfully different from the previous years, was a very long time indeed. They flew their attack runs anyway. All of them, every torpedo squadron that launched that morning, pressed their attacks into the teeth of the Japanese combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire. None of the torpedoes found their targets. The Devastator's airspeed was too low, its maneuvering capability too limited, its torpedo too prone to malfunctioning even on the occasions it wasn't shot out of the sky before release. And yet, as we established earlier in tonight's program, their attacks were not without consequence. The combat air patrol that annihilated Torpedo 8 was not watching the sky when McCluskey's dive bombers arrived at 20,000 feet. The connection between these two facts, the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons and the success of the dive bombers, is not proven with the certainty of a mathematical theorem. The Japanese combat air patrol was already moving to altitude before the dive bombers arrived, responding to radar contacts and visual sightings. The full story is more ambiguous than the clean narrative suggests. But the men of the torpedo squadrons did not know, in those final minutes, what their attacks would or would not accomplish. They knew what they were flying into, and they flew into it. That much is not ambiguous. Veterans watching tonight, or those who knew men who came home from something their friends did not come home from, will understand the particular weight of that stillness. It does not resolve. You carry it, and eventually you carry it quietly enough that the people around you can't see it anymore. But you carry it. That is not a historical observation, it is simply true. Chapter 18. The Intelligence Revolution Midway Confirmed. What Midway also established, beyond the tactical outcome, beyond the strategic consequences, beyond the individual stories of the men who fought it, was the primacy of signals intelligence in modern warfare. This is not a dramatic conclusion by the standards of 1942. The value of breaking enemy communications had been understood since the telegraph. But Midway demonstrated the principle at a scale and with a clarity that had rarely been achieved before, and it had lasting consequences for how the American military thought about intelligence gathering in the remaining years of the war. It is worth noting, because it is frequently overlooked in American accounts, that the team who broke JN-25 included Japanese-American analysts, Nisei men who had the language skills that made the work possible. This was not without irony, given that many of their families were simultaneously being held in internment camps under Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt in February of 1942. The men whose linguistic ability helped break the Japanese naval code were, in some cases, the sons and brothers of people being detained as potential security risks by the same government they were serving. That contradiction does not need to be resolved here. It needs to be named. The signals intelligence program that Rochefort's team pioneered was expanded significantly after Midway, with additional resources, additional personnel, and eventually additional institutional recognition. The breaking of Japanese naval communications provided American commanders with advance warning of major operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, contributing to engagements at the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, and numerous smaller actions. The intelligence infrastructure built in that Pearl Harbor basement cast a long shadow forward. The Japanese, for their part, suspected after Midway that their communications security had been compromised. There were investigations, there were reports. But the investigations concluded, incorrectly, that the Americans had likely benefited from a fortunate combination of air reconnaissance and operational luck, rather than a systematic code-breaking effort. The Japanese Naval Command upgraded their ciphers on a regular schedule regardless, which complicated American code-breaking, but they never fully grasped the depth of the penetration that Rochefort's team had achieved. This is, in retrospect, an extraordinary piece of luck for the Allied cause, and a significant intelligence failure on Japan's part, though one that their investigators could be forgiven for, since the alternative explanation required acknowledging that their communications had been read for months, which was not a comfortable conclusion. The concealment of Midway's true outcome from the Japanese public is itself a significant historical footnote. The Japanese government did not announce the loss of the 4 carriers. The survivors of the Kido Butai, the pilots and crew who returned, were kept in isolation, prevented from communicating with family or friends, and eventually redeployed without leave to prevent the news spreading. The official communiques reported a Japanese victory. The men who had been there knew otherwise. They kept the secret, or rather the secret was kept for them, since they were given no choice, and they went back to war, carrying the knowledge of what had actually happened, while their families read newspapers that told an entirely different story. That is a particular kind of burden. The Japanese culture of the 1940s did not offer much vocabulary for the experience of a catastrophic defeat that could not be acknowledged, mourned publicly, or contextualized within any official narrative that bore any relationship to reality. The survivors carried it privately. Some of them carried it for the rest of their lives. This is not a detail that belongs exclusively to the losing side of Midway. American veterans of the Pacific, the ones who came home, also carried things that the victory narrative had no room for. The men who had watched their friends go into the water or into the flames. The men who had made decisions under pressure and would spend decades wondering whether different decisions might have saved someone. The men who had survived when survival felt arbitrary. Victory does not clean any of that up. It merely provides a context in which the public narrative moves forward while the private experience remains wherever it was. Those of you watching tonight who have carried something like that, from the Pacific, from Korea, from Vietnam, or from the home front losses that don't always make it into the history books, I'd be honored if you shared your perspective in the comments. Not the official version, yours. Chapter 19. The Wreck and the Memory. Midway across 8 decades. Robert Ballard found the Yorktown in May of 1998, resting on her side approximately 3,000 meters below the surface, just under 2 miles down, for anyone who prefers the more visceral measurement. The dive expedition used a remotely operated vehicle to survey the wreck, and the footage showed a ship in better condition than anyone had expected. 56 years of Pacific Ocean had encrusted her in sea growth and dimmed her paint, but her basic structure was intact. The flight deck was recognizable. The bridge was there. The damage from the torpedoes and bombs was still visible on her sides. The evidence of June 4th permanently preserved in the cold dark of the deep Pacific. The Yorktown is a war grave. American law and naval tradition protect it from any salvage or disturbance, which is as it should be. The men who went down with her, and the men who went down in the Hamman alongside her, and the men who were in the water when the depth charges went off, are still there. They have been there since 1942, and they will be there as long as the ship lasts, which in the cold, deep ocean is a very long time indeed. Midway Atoll itself is now a national wildlife refuge, administered by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. The airstrips and some of the wartime buildings are still there, in various states of weathering, occupied now by the largest Laysan albatross colony in the world. Roughly 70% of the global population of that species nests on Midway. The birds have been there longer than the military was. They will likely be there long after the last physical traces of the battle have dissolved into the coral. There is something quietly appropriate about that. A place of enormous human violence returned to the patient occupation of creatures who have nothing to do with human conflicts and considerable indifference to human history. The albatrosses nest in the old ammunition bunkers. They raise their chicks in the shadow of the old command buildings. They have not read the history books, and they do not need to. The Battle of Midway entered American cultural memory with a speed and thoroughness that was partly genuine and partly constructed. The film, made in 1976, simply titled Midway, was watched by millions, did reasonable justice to the broad historical outline, and introduced Charlton Heston to a whole new generation of people who were apparently unaware he was in everything. The more recent version, released in 2019, used contemporary visual effects technology to render the dive-bombing attacks with a fidelity that earlier productions couldn't achieve, and was generally well received by veterans and historians for its attention to operational detail. Neither film could quite capture what it felt like to be in a devastator at 200 feet above the Pacific, committed to an attack run, with Zeros coming down from above. Some things the camera cannot get to. What the historical record gives us, and it is a remarkable record, because the post-battle interviews and after-action reports were conducted while the participants' memories were still fresh, and many of the men who flew that morning survived to write and speak about it extensively, is a detailed portrait of individual decision-making under conditions of extreme uncertainty and physical danger. Pilots who made navigational choices with incomplete information and inadequate fuel, commanders who held formation or broke it based on instincts that the official doctrine did not address. Men who pressed their attack runs when turning back would have been both understandable and survivable. The accumulation of those individual decisions, hundreds of them made in seconds under fire by young men who had been in the Navy for anywhere from 2 years to 15, is what actually produced the outcome. The strategy was Nimitz's. The intelligence was Rochefort's. But the battle was fought by the people in the cockpits and in the engine rooms and on the flight decks, and it was their choices. In the aggregate, that made the difference. That is worth sitting with for a moment, in the quiet of wherever you're listening tonight. Chapter 20. Luck, Skill, and the question we asked at the beginning. We asked, at the beginning of tonight's program, a question that deserves a direct answer, now that we have laid all the evidence on the table. How did an American strike force that was scattered, nearly out of fuel, and operating with outdated aircraft manage to find 4 of the most powerful warships in the world and destroy 3 of them in roughly 5 minutes? And why? On that particular morning, with all their training and experience and the most capable fighter aircraft in the Pacific, did the Japanese Combat Air Patrol fail to stop it? The honest answer, examined from every angle this story offers, is both skill and luck, in proportions that cannot be precisely measured and probably varied by the minute. The skill was real and earned. Rochefort's code-breaking had been meticulous, sustained, and brilliantly executed under conditions of physical exhaustion and institutional skepticism. Nimitz's decision to trust the intelligence picture and commit his carriers to an ambush rather than a defensive posture was a command judgment of the highest order. Spruance's decision not to pursue Yamamoto's battleships in the darkness was precisely the kind of disciplined restraint that prevents brilliant victories from becoming catastrophic overreach. McCluskey's decision to keep searching past the point where a more cautious man would have turned back was the choice of an officer who understood that the alternative was accepting defeat by default. The luck was also real and irreducible. The Arashi's wake, the catapult malfunction on the cruiser tone that delayed the float plane launch by 30 minutes and thus delayed Nagumo's warning of the American carrier presence, the particular overcast that had concealed the American fleet's position from Japanese search aircraft, the fact that McCluskey's fuel state had reached approximately the last margin that still allowed him to search rather than return, just as the destroyer's wake appeared below him, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol chasing the torpedo bombers at low altitude at exactly the moment the dive bombers arrived from above. Remove any one of those factors, and the morning of June 4th becomes something else entirely. Remove the code breaking and the carriers blunder into each other without preparation, with the element of surprise belonging to Nagumo rather than Spruance. Remove McCluskey's decision to keep searching, and the dive bombers return to the Enterprise with their bombs intact. Leave the Arashi on station rather than racing back to the fleet, and the wake that guided McCluskey northwestward was never laid. History is not a machine with a single output determined by its inputs. It is an accumulation of contingencies, decisions made under uncertainty, mechanical failures that happen or don't happen, human instincts that prove right or wrong in ways their possessors could not have known in advance. Midway is an unusually pure example of this, which is one of the reasons it has attracted so much historical attention. It is a battle in which you can point to specific moments, a wake, a delayed launch, a decision to keep searching, and say with reasonable confidence, here, right here, this is where it turned. The bombs left on the hangar deck, the ones not struck below to the armored magazine because there wasn't time, were not there because of a command failure or a lapse in discipline. They were there because an operational situation had required a rapid rearming decision, and the rational response to rapid rearming, when you have no expectation of being attacked in the next hour, is to prioritize speed over procedure. Nagumo's ordnance crews were not negligent. They were responding correctly to the information they had. The information was incomplete. That is how most catastrophic failures work, if you look at them closely enough. Not through malice or stupidity, but through the compounding of individually rational decisions made on incomplete information, in conditions of time pressure, by people who were doing the best they could with what they knew. That observation does not remove accountability. Nagumo made the rearming decision. He bore responsibility for its consequences. But it does make the human reality of the thing more comprehensible and more honest than the clean version in which one side gets everything right and the other gets everything wrong. Chapter 21. The Deeper Lesson. What Midway actually teaches. There is a version of the Midway story that is taught in schools, that appears in the summary paragraphs of general histories, that was reinforced by the 1976 film and has persisted through every subsequent retelling. The Americans won because they had better intelligence, and because their dive bomber pilots executed a perfectly timed attack that caught the Japanese carriers off guard. The end. That version is not wrong, but it is thin in a way that makes it less useful than the fuller story. The fuller story includes Rochefort in his bathrobe and the bureaucrats who relieved him. It includes the torpedo squadrons who attacked without escort and without realistic hope of survival and pressed their runs anyway. It includes Nagumo's genuine dilemma and the incomplete information that shaped his decisions. It includes the Yorktown salvage crew going back aboard a ship they had already abandoned because it was their ship and it was still floating. It includes George Gay in the water with a seat cushion, watching the carriers burn. It includes the Nisei analysts whose language skills made the code breaking possible while their families were in internment camps. The fuller story also includes the Japanese sailors on the Kaga and the Soryu and the Akagi, who had nothing to do with the strategic decisions that brought their ships to that position, and who died when the ordnance stored in the passageways caught fire, and who are as much a part of the human cost of Midway as any American pilot who didn't come back. War is not a sporting event in which the defeated side's casualties are a footnote. The men on those carriers were someone's sons too. They had trained for years. They believed in what they were doing with the same conviction that the men across the water believed in what they were doing. The machinery of national policy had brought them to that point in the Pacific. The machinery did not discriminate between them when it consumed them. What Midway actually teaches, beyond carrier doctrine and the importance of signals intelligence and the tactical merits of dive bombing versus torpedo attack, is something about how large historical outcomes are assembled from small human moments. The decisive battles of history are not won by strategies. Strategies are plans made in comfortable rooms before contact with the enemy. Battles are won by people making decisions in the moment with inadequate information, under physical and psychological stress that no planning document can fully account for, relying on training and instinct and the particular quality that experienced soldiers and sailors tend to call professionalism, which is not the same as fearlessness, but is rather the practiced ability to continue functioning effectively even in the presence of fear. McCluskey kept searching when fuel was critical. Waldron turned his squadron toward the carriers on instinct when the official course would have missed them. Spruance held his position in the darkness, rather than chasing an engagement he couldn't win. Rochefort's analysts worked through the night, in a basement, on inadequate sleep for months. None of these decisions were made in conditions of certainty. All of them were made in conditions of incomplete information, time pressure, and consequence. The people who made them did not know in the moment that they were making history. They were just doing the next thing in front of them, as well as they could with what they had. Chapter 22. Fading Light, The Last Reflections. There are men still alive, fewer every year, who have personal memories of the years Midway belonged to. Men who served in the Navy or the Army Air Corps and heard the news come through, who felt the particular quality of that moment when a string of disasters finally, against expectation, broke in the other direction. Their fathers and uncles had some of them fought at Midway. Their older brothers had been in the Pacific when the word came back of the carriers burning. The demographics of living memory are not forgiving. The men who flew at Midway are gone now. The last survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, George Gay, died in 1994. The last of the dive bomber pilots followed in the years after. What remains is the written record. The interviews conducted while they could still speak. The after-action reports filed when the details were fresh, and the oral histories gathered by historians who understood that the window for primary source accounts was closing faster than the official record acknowledged. The Battle of Midway is 83 years behind us now. It will continue moving further away at the rate of 1 year per year, as history does, and the proportions of what is remembered and what is lost will continue shifting in the direction that time always pushes them. The strategic significance will be maintained in the textbooks. The tactical narrative, the carriers, the dive bombers, the 4 minutes, is durable enough to survive. What will be harder to preserve is the texture of it. The smell of aviation gasoline on a carrier flight deck at 5 in the morning. The particular weight of a flight helmet and a Mae West life preserver on a day when you are about to need both. The sound of a carrier making ready for flight operations, the aircraft engines running up, the arresting wires being checked, the squawk of the flight deck address system over the wind. The silence in a ready room when a briefing is over and there is nothing left to say and the aircraft are waiting on the deck above. Those details are carried by human beings, not institutions. When the last person who held them is gone, they are gone. This is the ordinary tragedy of memory, the one that history as a discipline can partially address through oral history and archival preservation, but never fully solve. The record of what happened at Midway is extensive by the standards of combat documentation. We are extraordinarily lucky, by the standards of earlier centuries, in the richness of the primary source accounts that survive, and still, even with all of that, what we have is a reconstruction, a representation. The thing itself is unreachable. That evening, the evening of June 4th, 1942, the Pacific was calm after the violence of the day. The Kaga and the Soryu were already gone. The Akagi and the Hiryu were burning themselves out, attended by their escort destroyers, their crews having done everything that could be done, and then the last hardest thing, leaving. The Yorktown was still afloat, listing, her salvage uncertain. The Enterprise and the Hornet were recovering aircraft, counting the empty slots in the parking plan where aircraft had gone out and not come back. 3,000 miles away in Washington, officials were drafting the press release. In Tokyo, officials were drafting a rather different communiqué, one that bore essentially no relationship to what had actually occurred. The machinery of national narrative was already processing the day, shaping it into the forms that political and military institutions prefer. And in the water northwest of Midway, a young ensign named George Gay was floating with a seat cushion, watching the last fires, waiting for morning. Chapter 23. Closing Reflection. What they left behind. The Punch Bowl. Honolulu. The National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific sits in the bowl of an extinct volcanic crater above the city. A 24,000 grave military cemetery, the resting place of veterans of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. If you have been there, you know the particular quality of the silence in that crater. The way the volcanic walls hold the stillness, the way the rows of white markers stretch across the flat green floor of the bowl with a geometric precision that is both beautiful and almost unbearable to look at for too long, because each marker is a person, and the collective weight of that fact accumulates as you walk among them. Some of the men who did not come back from Midway are represented there in the memorial walls rather than individual graves because their remains were never recovered, Because the Pacific kept them. The ocean floor off Midway holds the physical evidence of the battle. The wrecks of the 4 carriers, the crashed aircraft, and the men who went down with them. The Yorktown, the 4 Japanese carriers, the Haman, they are all still out there, 2 or 3 miles below the surface, gradually being reclaimed by the processes of deep ocean chemistry and time. There is a certain peace in that image if you allow yourself to find it. The ships that were the instruments of such enormous violence in June of 1942 have been returned to stillness. They are quiet now, in the way that only the very deep ocean is quiet, a silence that has no weather in it, no season, no daylight and darkness, no time in any meaningful human sense. They rest. The men who are still aboard them rest. The world above has continued. The Pacific that closed over the carriers in 1942 has crossed and recrossed by 1,000 subsequent generations of ships, carrying 1,000 subsequent generations of commerce and migration and human purpose. The albatrosses on Midway Atoll have hatched and fledged their chicks season after season, decade after decade, in magnificent indifference to the history that occurred beneath their feet. The coral reefs have grown and shifted. The currents have continued their long, slow circuits. The ocean has not changed in any way that the ocean notices. But what happened there mattered. It mattered to the people who were alive in 1942 and understood what the 6 months before Midway had felt like. It mattered to the families of 307 Americans and 3,500 Japanese who did not come home from those 4 days in June. It mattered to the subsequent history of Asia and the Pacific in ways that are still working themselves out. The post-war order that was shaped by the Allied victory, the alliances and institutions and national trajectories that were determined in part by the outcome of that war. The world that the generation watching this program grew up in and helped to build. That generation. The one that lived through the 1930s and 40s, that understood rationing and sacrifice and the particular weight of a casualty telegram, that built the post-war world with the energy of people who had come through something and understood what was at stake if they failed to build it well, carries a knowledge that is not fully transferable by documentary or film or history book, however carefully made. It lives in the body in the particular quality of attention that people who have been close to real consequence tend to bring to everything that follows. If you are listening to this tonight, in the quiet, perhaps with the lights down low, perhaps already drifting toward the comfortable territory between waking and sleep that this kind of program tends to inhabit, you carry some of that knowledge. Whether you served, or whether you knew people who served, or whether you simply grew up in the world that generation made, you understand something about consequence and sacrifice that is not easy to convey to those who don't. The men at Midway, on both sides of it, were not heroes in the simplified sense that word has acquired in the subsequent decades of its overuse. They were people in an impossible situation, making the best decisions they could with incomplete information, and most of them were afraid, and most of them did their jobs anyway, and some of them came home, and most of them on the Japanese side, in particular, did not. What they left behind, beyond the strategic shift and the historical record and the wreck sites 2 miles below the Pacific, is a demonstration. A demonstration that ordinary people placed under extraordinary pressure, with inadequate equipment and incomplete information, and the knowledge that the man beside them may not be there tomorrow, can still do something remarkable, not because they are special, because they chose to. That is the inheritance. And it comes to us down the years, not through monuments or official communiques, or even history books, though all of those have their place, but through the memories and stories of the people who were there and the people who knew them. It travels through families, in the particular way that the significant experiences of one generation pass to the next, sometimes in explicit stories, more often in attitudes and silences, and the way a certain kind of person carries themselves when things get difficult. The Battle of Midway ended 83 years ago. The Pacific is still there. The ocean that closed over the carriers in June of 1942 still crosses and recrosses beneath the flights of albatrosses, beneath the surface of the ordinary world, carrying its history in silence 2 miles below where anyone goes. And somewhere in that darkness, resting on the Pacific floor in the cold and the absolute quiet, our 4 fleet carriers and all the men who went down with them, and all the decisions that brought them there, and all the consequences that flowed from those decisions into the world we are still living in. They are still there. They are not going anywhere. If tonight's program stirred something, a memory, a story your father told you, something you heard from a man who was there, or simply the particular quality of feeling that this kind of history produces in people who understand what it cost, I would be genuinely honored if you shared it in the comments below. Your generation holds history that is not in any book. The experiences of the people who lived through those years, who served or worked or waited or grieved through them, belong to the record in a way that no official account can replace. If you're willing to share even a piece of that, your own perspective, something you remember, something you were told, the comment section is yours. Now rest well, and I'll see you in the next one.